Seasonal explorations of native plants in the Piedmont. My name is Michael Cowan. I'm a member of the board for the state GNPS, and also a member of the education committee for the North Metro chapter. And that is who is bringing you this presentation. So as I said, this is the third. So we wanted to give a seasonal kind of walkthrough of just native plants and interesting facts about their interaction with the animals and the other flora. And to do that, we brought in Dr. John Storm, who is a professor of biology at South Carolina Upstate. And we found him through his very interesting Facebook page, which he'll tell you more about, but he posts daily on that. And so I've been following that for several years and thought it would be interesting to kind of work some of those interesting facts into these presentations. So that is how it happened. So if you're new to this, again, you didn't have to see the others for this to be interesting, but they will be interesting. So if you want to go back and look at them, you definitely can. But also, if you aren't a member of GNPS already, please visit our webpage. It's gnps.org. And in addition to becoming a member, you can browse and find tons of information on other native plants and the other activities that we are involved in, both at the chapter level and at the state level. And one of the activities that I want to bring up, so I'm chairman of the advocacy committee, and we are pushing to get a new state flower for Georgia because our current state flower, the Cherokee Rose, is not only non-native, it's actually native to southern China, but it's also an invasive plant and it causes economic disruption in much of the state. So we're trying to change that to the native sweet bay magnolia, which is common in the coastal plain and also the Piedmont. So if you haven't contacted your state rep yet about that, please do. The session starts next week. It's going to be introduced in the House first, and our goal is to get it passed out of that and over to the Senate in relatively short order. So the last housekeeping thing I wanted to point out, if you have a question during the presentation, you should see at the bottom of your screen or at the somewhere on the Zoom thing, there's a Q&A option. So if you put your question in there, everybody else can view those questions. And if you like a question that you see, you can actually upvote it. So put on there that you like it. And we get a ton of questions that'll kind of put those that most people have endorsed up to the top, and we can make sure we get them addressed at the end. But in general, I think we should have time to get to most of the questions. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to Professor John Storm.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. So I am John Storm. Some of you may have not seen a presentation by me before, but you might be familiar with my natural history writing on Southern Piedmont natural history. It's got the name right down there at the bottom. It's on Facebook and on Instagram. So you can, I get a bit more posting onto Facebook than Instagram, but a lot of the stuff I put on both now. But feel free to follow me there. And I post every day about something happening in the natural world right now in the Piedmont here of Georgia, the Carolinas, Alabama. That part of the world is where I focus, but get a bit more into other parts of the Southeast and the Eastern US as well, but primarily the Piedmont. So today we're going to talk about, let's see, is the top bar showing up for everybody, or is that just on my side? Is that blocking the top of the screen for people?
I see it fine.
Okay, so it's not blocking for you. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about things that are happening out there in the Piedmont during the winter time. So the order we're going to do that is we'll start off going over how certain plants are adapted to have an evergreen lifestyle, which is a bit different from what we think of for most plants with the deciduous lifestyle where they lose the leaves in autumn. Some of them hold on to the leaves with their marcescence. We've talked about that before with beech trees and such. We'll go into seed stratification and scarification, how those work, sometimes in combination to help plants get ready for spring. We'll go into annual life cycles in particular for what types of plants tend to be annuals, or most plants that are native annuals, that kind of a thing. And then we'll look at some of the things you're going to find going on in the wintertime over the coming months in January through March here in the Piedmont. And then we'll end going into some of the things to find out there in leaf litter this time of year and why leaf litter is so important for lots of different life forms to survive these cold winter days like we're getting right now, especially. So, to start off with evergreen plants, these are, of course, plants that are evergreen. They're green year round. They don't lose their leaves. They keep them year round. Now, that's not to say that they don't replace their leaves. They do replace them. They just don't drop them all at once, like you might think a maple tree doing, or some of our other deciduous trees, but they do replace them. It just may take 2 or 3 or 4 years for something like a pine tree to do that, and it doesn't do it all at once. But some of our native evergreens, things like the Carolina jessamine that you see here on the left, that'll be flowering here in a few months. That's a native evergreen. The mountain dog hobble there on the right that lives along streams, native evergreen here to the Georgia, North Georgia area into the mountains. American holly, a very common one to find in dry woodlands across the Piedmont and much of the eastern U.S. And of course, probably our most common pine tree in many areas are the loblolly pine, along with others like the shortleaf pine, the longleaf pine, that are evergreen as well. So lots of evergreen native plants around here in the Piedmont and beyond. So in terms of where these evergreen plants tend to be, you can find them in lots of different habitats here in the eastern US, but one of the places you find a lot of them are in areas maybe down more like the coastal plain where there's not as much variation from summer to winter in temperature and also good evenness of moisture throughout the year. If you have those conditions where there's not this risk of freezing of the leaf tissue and there's enough moisture to keep on doing photosynthesis and not get desiccated and lose too much water, plants will keep their leaves if those conditions are right. Another factor that tends to correlate with evergreen plants is that they tend to be in nutrient-poor soils. And by having these evergreen leaves, keeping photosynthesis going throughout more of the year, getting more energy production by photosynthesis, that can help to overcome some of these nutrient-poor soil conditions. You also tend to find it in areas with shorter growing seasons. So up at the high elevations of the Appalachian Mountains, more into boreal habitats further north. Areas with fewer growing days tend to be where you see more of these evergreen plants, but we have them here too as well in North Georgia and other parts of the Piedmont. So that's not to say that there's not some challenges with each type of vegetation, deciduous and evergreen. For instance, if you've got a deciduous tree with leaves like a sweet gum here, they lose their leaves in October into November. And if they didn't, they would have certain challenges that would come with that, like having those leaf tissues get frozen. So whenever we get cold weather like we're getting right now at night, and we'll have here in the coming days, where we're getting well below zero for this part of the world, if you had those leaves still on the tree and you were using them actively for photosynthesis, they weren't just dangling there as this dead marcescent leaf, those leaves could get freezing of ice within their tissues, and that could do lots of damage to that leaf, rendering it to die. So if you're going to be evergreen, you've got to be able to control that freezing of leaf tissue. You've also got another challenge of how do you deal with water loss? So if the soil were to get frozen, for instance, you're not going to get water up through the roots very easily in hard frozen soil during the winter time. Or if you've got a leaf like on the sweet gum right here with all of that very high surface area to volume ratio, simply meaning there's a lot of space in area there across that flat paper-like surface to lose moisture. And it's not very thick, so there's not a lot of volume. So it's mostly just surface in this thin leaf, and you can lose a lot of water. So in the wintertime, when there's short days, you can't do a lot of photosynthesis. It may be really cold. You're going to lose a lot of water with a leaf design like the sweet gum here for a deciduous tree. So that's some of the factors for why they tend to be deciduous. But if you're going to be evergreen, you've got to overcome those challenges. So you've got to have a way to handle freezing of leaf tissues and to manage that, or to manage water loss. We'll see some of the ways that evergreen trees and other plants do that in just a second. Another factor you've got to deal with is if you are evergreen, you're holding on to those leaves longer throughout the year, and many of them keep those leaves for multiple years, like a loblolly pine here in the Piedmont or a Virginia pine. Many of them keep their leaves for 3 years or so, their needles. So if you're going to keep those needles for that length of a time period, you've got to be able to keep them from getting eaten up by a caterpillar across those 36 months of their life, which is a lot longer time period to keep those needles than, say, a sweet gum tree has from April to October with that leaf in just 1 year. So you tend to see these evergreens having a lot of investment of energy into anti-herbivory chemicals, and we'll see some of that in just a second here. So we're going to take a little tour of the inside of plants here for just a second, looking into the microscopic world and some of the adaptations that they have to be evergreen and how that might differ from a deciduous leaf structure. So we're going to start off looking at one that is deciduous. It loses its leaves, and that's with a lilac, the common lilac, Syringa vulgaris. Some people may have had this in a hedgerow or something like that. Me growing up on the farm in Iowa, we had those going around a lot of our property around the house and stuff like that. My mom really liked the common lilacs from Europe. If we look at one of their leaves, and I'll sort of take that leaf right there, for instance, and if we were to section right across like that, cutting it with the scalpel and look straight down that leaf, it would look something like this right here, with that midrib where the leaf stalk or petiole comes up right here in the middle, and then thin leaf tissue off to the side. So if we blow that up and we're looking straight down that leaf, like you see right here, so there's your eye looking straight down at that leaf, and we section it across the middle. And so you're looking into the top and bottom and middle of that leaf tissue. It would look something like what we see right here. So we've got the top of the leaf right here. There's all the tissues in the middle, and then a bottom layer of epidermis tissue on the other side of that leaf. So there's certain adaptations that we can see on this deciduous leaf, like a very thick, or excuse me, not a very thick layer of wax, a cuticle it's called. So if we look at this tissue right here, that's called the cuticle. And that wax, just like you would have on a car, repels water. So you think of putting wax on, say, a car after you wash it, and that causes the water to bead up. On a leaf of a lilac like this here, that wax cuticle on the outside and on the bottom and top of that leaf keeps moisture in the leaf tissue. So it prevents it from drying out and desiccating. So, but not as much cuticle wax as we're going to see here in just a second. They've also got a lot of these openings on the bottom of the leaf called a stomata, or a stoma in the singular. Stoma means mouth. You may have heard of things like colostomy, a mouth into your colon or large intestine, colostomy. Stoma means mouth. And so these openings on the tissue of a plant's leaf, like a mouth, are called stomata. And part of their function is to let things like the oxygen that the plant makes by photosynthesis out through those stomata into the atmosphere for us to breathe in, but also water comes out of it as well. So if you're going to keep these very thin, high surface area to volume leaves in the winter time when there's short days, not as much sunlight, if those stomata are open, you could be losing a lot of water relative to the amount of sugar you're making by photosynthesis. That could lead to some challenges with drying out and dying as a leaf and potentially as a bush or a tree. We're going to contrast that with a pine tree like this one right here, this loblolly pine, and look at its needles and how does it adapt to being evergreen at the microscopic level. So we've got one needle that we're looking at, like this one right here. And it's sort of like I took a pair of scissors and I chopped and cut off the end of that needle. And now we look right down into that needle. So it's roughly circular in shape. So it's sort of like me looking down right at the end of this needle right here after I snipped off the end of it with a pair of scissors. That's what we're looking at here. So we blow that up to be a big view of a pine needle, and there's certain features that we can see on that that adapt it for its existence of an evergreen. Things like these resin channels around that pine needle that gives off this sticky resin material that you may see on a pine tree for where they get injuries to the bark, that kind of thing. That resin, besides just helping to heal up an injury, is also an adaptive feature of those needles because it has anti-herbivory properties that help to keep caterpillars and beetles from feeding on those needles. So that's one of the ways that they're adapted to keep needles for several years and not have them get eaten up like you might think of for a deciduous leaf. They're very rich with anti-herbivory chemicals from that resin. If we blow up that needle some more and take like just this section of that needle right here and look at it sort of zoomed in, you can see that they have a very thick waxy cuticle. That's this sort of transparent layer right here, right on the very outside of the needle. Very thick layer of wax, keeping water in the needle so it doesn't escape out. That's going to help it not dry out or desiccate on those dry winter days with all of that wind when the outside atmosphere just isn't as humid as it would be during the summertime. They've also got stomata or a stoma in the singular, but they're a little different in their arrangement from what we saw on the lilac just a second ago. On their stoma, they're not here at the very surface of that needle. They're sunk in a little recess like you see right here, giving us this opening into the inner tissues of that needle, but it's in a little recess. What that does is it helps to keep those openings out of the wind. So when those needles are blowing around in that cold, dry winter wind, they don't lose as much moisture out of the stoma as they would if they were right there at the surface of the needle. So another adaptation to keep those needles for a long time and not dry out in that colder winter air to allow you to be evergreen and survive. Now, other native plants that you'll find around in the Piedmont, even so, more so getting up into the mountains, are to see rhododendrons, which are also evergreen, keeping those leaves throughout the entire year. And you may be familiar with the fact that you can sometimes gauge the temperature of is it above freezing or below freezing based on the shape of those leaves on rhododendrons. So this is a picture I took driving through Tennessee in the Smoky Mountains with some rhododendrons on a chilly winter day. And those leaves are starting to droop down, just starting to curl a little bit there in that cold air. And if it gets even colder, they'll really start to curl up and exhibit this behavior of rhododendron leaves in cold weather. That movement of the leaves in this curled up structure is what is called thermonasty, these temperature movements of those leaves. And it's an adaptive behavioral response of many different rhododendrons. Based on experiments with what this does for those rhododendrons, it reduces their sun exposure as you coil up that leaf like we see right there. So it's not getting as much of that intense sunlight onto those rhododendron leaves. And it's getting it less wind exposure to that tissue as well, less wind onto those stomata, those little mouth-like openings, to not lose as much water as they would if those leaves were open. So it's an adaptive behavioral response of that plant, the rhododendron, to reduce water loss and to also help to limit the amount of photosynthesis that's being done, or to realize actually less inhibition of the photosynthesis, so that they continue to make some sugars with those leaves there. So an adaptive behavior with this evergreen rhododendron to keep the leaves all year. So that's some of the adaptations to be evergreen. Now, for many plants, they've dropped their seeds, they've produced those over the summer or into the fall, and now they're maybe down in the leaf litter, down by the soil, overwintering, but not coming up as a new plant germinating just yet. They're going to do that maybe in a few months or in a few years. So why are they doing that? How do they do that? Through this process of stratification and scarification. And that's what we're going to go into next here. So let's imagine it being a situation like some partridge berries growing in the summertime, this native low little running plant that you have in woodlands. And that partridge berry has these red fruits that you can see in fall and really any time of the year, but mostly in the fall and the winter, you see them. And they've got seeds within those red fruits. And those seeds have to know when to pop up and germinate to grow more partridge berry. So from the seed's perspective, it's sort of like that seed sitting in that fruit thinking, is it spring yet? Should I germinate now? Is it time to grow out and form a new partridge berry? Even though it would be a little hard to do that when you're still in the fruit there, but that's to give it a human quality here, to anthropomorphize the seed. Those are the decisions it is making about its life history. Is it time to grow yet? Now, the plants fortunately have this internal calendar of keeping track of the time of the year. So partridge berry seed up in the soil is probably not going to germinate this time of year. Some plants would, but not a lot of them. So they have these mechanisms to keep track of the moisture level of the soil and how moist that seed is, what the temperature is like. Has it been increasing and decreasing in temperature? Has it been cold long enough? Those features of this stratification will allow that plant to know when it's time to grow up and germinate, and it's probably going to gauge that pretty well. There can be some mistakes on that, but hopefully, if you've got enough cold period, it'll germinate and not come out at the wrong time of the year and end up being out there in the snow like we might have here in just a couple of days or so. So that seed has to know, based on that stratification of how many cold days have we had, cold and warm alternating, along with some moist soil. It depends on the species. When is it time to germinate and grow up out of the soil? And for many plants, that's in the spring, after you've had a long period of cold, which indicates to them, okay, the winter period is over. We're into the warmer time. Should be safe to germinate, grow out of the soil, start to grow those tender young shoots, and not be killed by cold weather, ice, snow, that sort of a thing. So if you grow plants from seed, you probably had to think about this a fair amount. Like if I bought seeds from some native plant company, how do I have to stratify them? Do I have to put them in the refrigerator? Do I put them just off into the leaf mulch and let nature take its course? Do I have to keep it moist constantly? Do I have to cycle the temperatures up and down? What should I do? It varies a bit from plant to plant. So hopefully that information is available for you somewhere. And if you're wanting to figure out how would I know what to do with those seeds that I collected from nature or maybe purchased somewhere, the easiest place to go is just to Google it, ask Siri, whatever it is, and you might be surprised how easy it is to find some of that information. However, a place I often go is to look at a reputable company like Prairie Moon Nursery, for instance, out of Minnesota. And they have a nice stratification guide on their website for lots of native plants, some that live in the Piedmont of Georgia, others that maybe don't live in the Piedmont of Georgia, but many of them do. And if you look at their germination guide on their website, they have it nice and letter coded by is this plant an A or a B or a C stratification scheme. And that tells you really easily what you need to do with those seeds. For instance, if we click on this one right here, oops, I don't think I can get to that, I guess. Maybe I can get it. Nope, I can't click on it with the laser pointer here, it looks like. But if you Google Prairie Moon Nursery, enter the name of any plant, it'll show you the letter there for their stratification. And so you would know if it's letter G for that plant, it's going to germinate successfully in cool soil, sow seeds in late fall. That's the best way to handle getting that seed to stratify so it comes up at the right time of the year and you can have your native plant growing successfully off there in your yard, hopefully. So that's stratification of seeds. Now, sometimes those seeds may not be just a seed by itself. It may have this fruit around it. So that brings us to the point of what is the purpose of a fruit? Why do plants produce fruits? Why do angiosperms, these flowering plants, produce a fruit? And the answer is based on what you would see right here off in the woods. You would immediately know if you saw something like this off in the leaf litter that people are around because no other organism would eat an apple or some other fruit and leave all of those seeds in the middle. Everything else eats the whole fruit for the most part. So that tells you people. Other animals don't do that. So that brings us to the point of why do plants attract these frugivorous, fruit-eating birds, mammals, and other wildlife in the first place? What does it do for the plant? It's a lot of energy to produce this fruit, but it does some pretty good things for that plant. For instance, when a bird or a raccoon or a coyote eats a fruit, they're not going to eat around the seeds. They're going to eat the whole thing and then fly off or walk off somewhere and transplant that fruit seed in their feces in some new habitat. So that gives the plant a way to send its seed far away, miles and miles away from the parent plant. It also gets that plant seed in a nice pile of fertilizer. They don't have to go off to the farm and garden store and get the right NPK fertilizer. Their seed is put right into that fertilizer in the soil from that coyote or cedar waxwing, whatever wildlife it might be. It also enables that seed to be scarified. That's one of the ways that we scar or start to wear away at that hard seed coat on the outside of the seed. So there are some seeds where there is a required or beneficial impact of this scarification. And that could be from the digestion of that bird and the enzymes of their digestion starting to break away that hard outer seed coat. Or maybe that scarification is done by bacteria in the soil, fungi in the soil, wearing away that seed coat enabling that plant to then open up the seed and germinate and grow out in the spring or in a couple of years. They've oftentimes got to have that scarification of the seed coat through some mechanism, which brings us to the point of, is this bird or mammal eating this fruit and its seeds something that's adaptive for the plant in ways other than just dispersing it to new habitats? Fortunately for us, there have been some studies done on this, such as this scat right here from a coyote full of persimmon seeds. So this is some data coming from a paper by Cipher and Cipher in 1999, who looked at raccoons and coyotes that they fed persimmons to, or that had been eating persimmons out in nature, and how well did those seeds from raccoon scat and coyote scat germinate relative to fruits that they just took out of persimmons by themselves, by hand, and that didn't get consumed by a coyote or a raccoon first. So fortunately for us, they picked those seeds out for us, and so we can have the answer. We don't have to pick out the seeds from coyote scat. They did that for us. So what did they find here? Well, they found that for raccoons, if they eat persimmon fruits, their seeds germinated at a higher level if the raccoons ate the fruits, relative to if they just hand-picked those seeds out of the persimmon and tried to grow them that way. So in this sense, raccoons increased the likelihood of germination for that persimmon tree. On the contrary, though, if it was eaten by a coyote, it actually lowered the germination rate. So there's something perhaps about damage from the chewing of that coyote with its teeth, or the length of time it's passing through its digestive tract, getting worn away by enzymes that reduced the germination rate of those persimmon seeds relative to just picking them out by hand. So not all organisms necessarily benefit the plant in terms of germination. However, there's other benefits that could still come, even if you lowered their germination, and some of them still do germinate. We'll see that here in just a second. So that leads us to birds. They eat a lot of fruits too. For instance, southern arrowwood, northern spicebush are eaten by lots of songbirds during migration, and also resident birds that stay here. And so this study looked at cedar waxwings and thrushes eating these two native plants' fruits. And what did that do for their likelihood of germination? So what these authors found, Meyer and Whitmer, is that if a bird ate them, there doesn't seem to be any germination benefit to that southern arrowwood or to that northern spicebush, relative to if the researchers just opened up that fruit, picked out the seeds themselves by hand, and grew those seeds after stratifying them in a refrigerator. So the birds don't really give them that benefit like you might have thought. However, remember, they still did transport them somewhere else out in nature. So we're sort of ignoring that benefit right now. However, if you look at songbird germination relative to if nothing took those seeds out and you didn't open them up by hand at all, songbirds and hand removal led to those seeds germinating and growing up as a new persimmon tree better than if the seeds were just left in the fruit and the fruity pulp rotted and decomposed around those seeds eventually. So that leads us to this idea of seed removal being one of, if not the primary benefit that a bird might give to a southern arrowwood or a northern spicebush. By eating that fruit, they get that pulp off of the seeds. And you could do that with your hands too, just as well from the perspective of the persimmon tree. But chances are, or the bushes here, but people aren't going off and getting every northern spicebush fruit. They're dependent on the birds to do that. Plus, the birds transport them to new habitats. So, several benefits that come, even if it's not germination through the digestive tract or scarification through the digestive tract relative to just picking them out by hand with people. So, this gives you some confidence that certain fruits, just taking them apart by hand, taking out those seeds, like I did with this partridge berry right here, can be very effective at getting them to germinate, even if a raccoon or a bird didn't eat them and have that seed go through its digestive tract to scarify it. So this is where looking up with the stratification guide at Prairie Moon or elsewhere what that particular plant needs is very important. For instance, with partridge berry Mitchella repens, when I have collected them, I don't bother stratifying them in a refrigerator. I just pick out the seeds by hand and I put them onto the moist soil surface under some leaf litter and let that take care of itself out there. Because the recommendations for this one is to stratify it for maybe a year or two and to have multiple warming periods and then cooling periods in succession, which is sort of a pain to do if you're doing it yourself. So I just put them off there in my leaf litter, and they seem to do pretty well that way. That's a much easier way to do it for this plant in particular. So that's the stratification of seeds, keeping track of moisture and temperature for when is the right time to grow up and germinate out of the soil, and also the scarification, the wearing away of that hard seed coat by the digestive tract of a bird or bacteria in the soil, whatever. The scarification you may be familiar with doing by using sandpaper or a file, or put them into boiling water for 30 seconds, put them in vinegar for a minute, something like that. Those are some of the ways that we recommend to scarify and sort of reduce the hardness of that seed coat sometimes. So we're going to transition now to looking at another way that plants differ in their lifestyle, and that's to be an annual plant or a perennial plant. So do you, at these two extremes, live your entire life from germinating as a seed to reproducing and then dying in 1 year like an annual? Or do you live for many years and maybe not even reproduce your first year? And that's the perennial life strategy with variation in between of some of that. Most of our native plants that you would think of are perennial, but that doesn't mean there aren't some annuals as well. For instance, plants here like orange jewelweed, that's an annual plant. So it doesn't have a perennial grow back every year from the same plant biology. Blue toadflax or oldfield toadflax is an annual, as well as the tiny bluets that pop up in yards and cemeteries in early spring. They are an annual as well, dropping seeds that will grow into next year's generation. This same plant doesn't grow back next year. So why would a plant be an annual, and why isn't every plant just a perennial? Why do they have these differences in the way they go about their existence, their life history? Well, a lot of it, based on research, appears to have to do with the environment that they live in. So if that plant lives in a place with high juvenile survival, so a good rate of success of growing up from seed to adulthood, but then a low survival as an adult, that tends to be a feature of annuals. You're not going to live a long life as an adult, so you better reproduce quickly. So one way to think of this, and this is how we do it a lot in biology for this life history, or basically how you live your existence and invest your energy, is to think of a sort of pie chart energy budget for that plant throughout the year. So for any organism, they've got 3 different ways you can spend your energy as sort of a simplistic model of this. You can put your energy into growing and germinating to grow up to be an adult plant and get bigger. You've then got to maintain those tissues and do upkeep. And you've also got to put energy into reproduction. So producing seeds and fruits here. That's where your energy is going to go. But not all plants put that into three equal pools of energy. It varies from one species to another. And if you're an annual, a lot of that energy goes into reproduction. So they're going to grow quickly, not spend as much energy on maintenance. They're just hoping to grow quick because you're not going to live long as an adult, reproduce, and that's it. It's a short time window to get everything done to reproduce and pass on your genes to the next generation. So their strategy is sort of a reproduce quickly before you die. And that's the life of an annual plant like the blue toadflax or the jewelweed that we just saw. Many of these plants, not surprisingly, given that short time period as an adult, they're not going to have flowers for very long as a given individual. So you better be able to self-pollinate if the conditions aren't right to have a pollinator bring those pollen from another plant to you. So that's another feature that we tend to see in annual plants with that short adult lifespan is to self-pollinate more readily than a perennial does. But there's, of course, variation within that. But that's a general tendency of annuals. In terms of where you find lots of these annual plants, they have a tendency to be in open habitats, areas with lots of disturbance, or with unreliable weather, climate, and moisture. It's just not very predictable relative to certain other habitat types. They also tend to be in areas that are quickly colonized, so open dirt and rock faces that are being colonized by species of plants as the first plants to start to grow there. Many of those first plants, where you might be the only one, those are annual plants. Once again, if you're the only one, you better be able to self-pollinate because there's not another mate or pollinator coming around to find just you. So that's why those features tend to go together. And a good place to find many of these annual plants is in a place like a granitic bald or an open granite face like we find on monadnocks. So we can see that kind of an example right here with Stone Mountain in Georgia, but in other places as well, which leads me into where we're going to go for what to look for in winter, getting here into January and in the coming few months. So let's talk about some of these places that are monadnocks, these granitic outcrops, where you find a lot of those annual plants. So one place you can go in your area to find them is Arabia Mountain, which you see right here with this nice sunshot photo. Very thin soil. Some areas just maybe a crust of lichens on that rock and no real soil at all. That's a place where many of the plants, but not all of them, but many of them are annuals in this very short growing period season where there's a lot of dryness to worry about because there's not soil to retain that moisture. Lots of wind, can get very hot in the summer around that rock, very cold and exposed in the winter. It's a place where not a lot of perennial plants live relative to annuals. So one of those annual plants that you can find out there right now just starting to grow is elf orpine. So this species right here that if you were to go out there right now in January, might look something like this right here as it's just starting to come out of cracks and rocks with just a bare amount of soil. It's oftentimes one of the very first native plants to grow in these places like the tops of Arabian Mountain, in those cracks between the rocks where there's just a little bit of dirt. So it's not a common plant. You only find it on these granitic balds and primarily in places like the Piedmont of Georgia, the Piedmont of North and South Carolina. That's where you find them in these very disparate monadnock and granitic open spaces. If you go out there later in the year, getting into March or April, they start to flower. And so they're starting to reach that end of their lifetime here before they drop seeds very early on, just as we're getting into spring. So it's a winter annual plant. As we mentioned, pretty harsh environment to live in. They've got that annual life history. Get all of that reproduction done in 1 year quickly because it's not a place to live a long life easily. And they are oftentimes one of the first plants to grow in those very thin cracks where there's hardly any soil at all. By late March, they're going to start to bloom into April, and then they produce their seeds, drop those seeds into those cracks, and that's it. That plant dies, and those seeds give us the next generation next year, hopefully, as a winter annual. So fun plant to go check out here in the wintertime and into very early spring. In terms of the pollinators for them, bees do some of the pollination, but a lot of it is actually done by ants in this very early spring time period, taking pollen from one flower to another. Another plant you can find right now, a native plant, is the cranefly orchid. Now, you're not going to see the flowers of this plant right now, and those flowers are really never easy to find, even in the summertime when they come out. But it is a very easy plant to find this time of the year because it's one of those evergreen plants that's common in the Piedmont, right down there in the leaf litter. And so as you're walking around through the woods, you see these green leaves on the ground, and there's a good chance it might be something like this cranefly orchid. To confirm that, easiest thing to do is turn that leaf over like we see right here, and there's this nice purple underside to them. Now, the top of the surface of the leaf is going to vary a bit with which morphology of the leaf it has. Some of them are just green on top. Others have these speckles of purple, and others all still the same species, are purple on both top and on the bottom. So there's 3 different morphologies to that leaf within cranefly orchids. There's been some research into, is there some adaptive function to one versus the other on these orchids? And some of the data suggests that the leaves that are purple, both top and bottom, are adaptive in that they blend in very well with leaf litter at night. So a deer going off to forage and seeing these nice green leaves, that might stick out to it a bit better in the leaf litter at night than these darker purple leaves. And so that might be an anti-herbivory morphology to prevent deer from eating those purple or magenta colored leaves of cranefly orchids. So head out there. This is the easy time of year to find them. They leaf out in fall and have the leaves over the winter. They're really much harder to find in the summertime, but very diagnostic now in the winter time on that brown leaf litter. Another plant that you'll start to see you're getting into early February, into March, early April is the round-lobed hepatica. It's one of the first native plants to flower in spring, and it gets these nice lavender flowers that show up in moist woodlands like I've got here on one I found in a shady ravine. These lavender petals that you see here are actually not the petals of this plant. They're actually the sepals, but it sort of looks like these big lavender petals showing pollinators to come in there and get some nectar. And their typical pollinators are bees and flies that go and get that pollen stuck on their body, carry it off to another plant, and transfer that pollen to the stigma of a flower and lead to the production of a seed with fruits, or a fruit with seeds. So that's Going to be happening here in about a month or so, the earliest of the round-lobed hepatica starting to bloom. Also in early February here, probably not one you're going to look forward to as much, is you will see a lot of this starting to show up in roadsides, people's yards, disturbed habitats, and that is purple dead nettle. Very, very common plant in these winter habitats with these pinkish flowers and sort of purplish tinged leaves here in about a month and on into the early parts of spring, perhaps. Not from here. It's actually native to Eurasia, but very widely spread today in lots of habitats around people. Now, it's called a dead nettle for a reason. It does have a lot of these little hairy structures called trichomes on the leaves, like a nettle would have, but unlike your typical nettles that you would think of, it doesn't sting you when you touch the leaves. Hence, it is a dead nettle. They don't sting you like a regular nettle. So that's apparently where the idea of the dead nettle plant comes from. By mid-February, very common here once again is you'll start to see red maple starting to flower, and they do that as a dioecious tree. So dioecious, meaning from the Greek two houses, is where that word comes from. And that's just the fancy science way of saying there's a male tree and a female tree. So on some of the red maples, you'll see flowers that look like this. And these are the male flowers with these little bulbous tips full of the pollen. Those are structures called anthers. And that would be on some trees. Other trees are female trees that have flowers that look like this with these two stigmas, these little bulbous sticky tips that will catch some of that pollen coming from a male tree that's a different individual. So they are dioecious, separate sexes to those trees. Sometimes you find red maples that have both male and female flowers, but oftentimes they are either a male flowering tree or a female flowering tree. Much of their pollination happens by wind, but they also have bees and flies that come along and take that pollen from one red maple to another and produce those winged samara fruits that we're familiar with red maples later on into the spring. Also at this time period, even though it's not spring, you might start to hear spring peepers. This is a very common frog to hear in the wintertime. Really, anytime it gets above 45 degrees or so, you might hear these spring peepers. So if it's 45 degrees and pretty cold, it's going to sound very different than if it's much warmer, or if it's just one individual versus a whole big group of dozens and dozens of them. But it's a very common sound to hear once you're getting into February with this beep, beep sound. So I can show you what it sounds like here with the video much easier than trying to mimic it here. So that's at low abundance. Chorus frogs in the background there too. And here's full chorus of many of them. So that beep, 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 beep is your spring peeper. Very common to hear at that time of year there. Also going on there in February, getting on into later February and into March is we start to see in woodlands spring beauty starting to flower. So these very short, fragile looking plants, very beautiful native wildflower, one of the first that we see in the spring. You can find them in yards. They're in cemeteries a lot of times, woodlands, down in bottomlands. It's always a fun one to look for around late February into March, the spring beauty. One of their distinctive features here is to see these pink lines going along the petals right there. And those are nectar guides that help to draw bees in towards that nectary reward. And of course, in the process, then get dusted with all of the pollen of that spring beauty, these pink structures right there, full of pollen to dust onto that bee. And many times the bee that comes in there is the spring beauty bee, very aptly named, because oftentimes it goes after spring beauties as a source of nectar and transferring pollen from one spring beauty to another spring beauty. Also, in late February, you'll start to see the sharp-lobed hepatica starting to bloom, and then on into March and stuff. Uh, Also, one of our native wildflowers living off in woodlands, pollinated by bees and flies. It's another one of the um, hepatica, or these liver-leafed plants here with these lobings. The hepatica genus right here refers to the liver-like shape of those leaves with the lobes, sort of like the morphology of someone's liver. And that's where the name of the genus comes from with these hepaticas. Now, coming into early March, it's going to be one of your favorite times of year here, where you start to get the pollen coming from the pine trees. I'm sure it's one of your favorite times, maybe not. This is when the world will shortly be turning dust colored yellow with all of this sort of like bags of chalk dust being dumped all over the world from pine trees and oak trees. It's at this time that those male pine cones are not yet reproductively mature, but you start to see them developing. So if you look down at the lower branches on a loblolly pine, a Virginia pine, any pine tree that you find around here in the Piedmont, you'll start to see these clusters of greenish yellow to yellow tubes like this. They sort of look like immature corn on the cob at a very miniature, maybe inch long size. And those are the developing male cones or pollen cones on a pine tree. Not the same thing as the big pine cone that you think of that's woody. That's the female cone. This is the pollen producing cone. You'll also get shoots of new needles starting to show up in early March. So this is that branch tip of the pine tree starting to grow out and extend. And then there's all of these needles just starting to bud out and grow this new cluster of needles on that branch tip of the loblolly pine tree. So that's early March. Also, at that time period, heading into a woodland, you might start to see toothworts starting to bloom. This one here, the cut leaf toothwort, with that very cut leaf shape going back and forth there. Native wildflower pollinated by bees, and it's got that toothwort name from the appearance of its rhizomes, or underground shoots, or runners, as you may call them. If you were to pull those up and look at them up close, which I don't recommend you doing because you can kill the plant potentially, or at least harm it. But if you were to do that, it's got all these tooth-like projections on that rhizome or runner, and that's where this toothwort name comes from, is from that projecting structure set on the rhizomes. So toothwort starting to bloom there in early March. Very beautiful and common spring wildflower. By mid-March, favorite time for many people, when you start to get things like bloodroot and little sweet Betsy starting to come into flower in woodlands before the trees are leafing out. Very common wildflowers to find, with these beautiful white blooms of bloodroot that open up for a day or two, and then they're done. And hopefully we're pollinated by some bees. By mid-March, we've also got one of our first shrubs starting to leaf out, and that's the painted buckeye. This picture here has it well leafed out already, and it's even starting to get ready to flower there, which it does in April. but it's one of the first shrubs to leaf out as early as mid-March. And then by August or July, the leaves are starting to turn colors and are dropped well before your typical maples and sweet gums drop their leaves. So painted buckeye in bottomland forests, one of the first things to leaf out there around mid-March into later March. So be on the lookout for that if you've never seen it before. It's also a great native plant to have around in a woodland or your yard. Lots of different species feed on that vegetation. For instance, caterpillars of the Luna moth feed on the painted buckeyes and other buckeye leaves. Imperial moths, those big yellow ones that you might see by a porch light on your house or something. Cecropia moths, also very big. Their caterpillars feed on buckeyes as one of their host plants. So great plant to feed wildlife. By late March into April, you start to get the service berries in bloom, species like the downy service berry that you can find in woodlands. Now, this one's also called shadbush. There's stories that you'll hear for either type of name. The serviceberry is the one, or sarvisberry, some people call it, that tends to vary a bit more. Some stories say that the service names come from the fact that this tree would flower around late March when the ground would start to thaw, say up in the mountains, and it's time to have a funeral service for somebody that may have died in the wintertime because now you can dig into the soil. That's one of the stories for where the service name comes from. Another is that they tend to bloom around the time of Easter service. So maybe that's why some people tend to call it serviceberry. But it's also called shadbush because right around the time they flower is the time period when shad fish would be coming upstream in coastal rivers to reproduce. And so the time that the running of the shad would occur lined up with when these flowers are in bloom. And so when you see those downy service berries or shadbush flowering, that's your cue. Time to go insane for shad. There's going to be a lot of them there in the rivers to catch if I get my net out there to catch them. Also fed on by lots of native caterpillars, right around 80 or so in the Piedmont region around Atlanta. So things like the eastern tiger swallowtail, for instance, their caterpillars feed on the leaves of shadbush or downy serviceberry. So a nice one to look for here before many of the trees have leafed out. And in the case of serviceberry, they typically flower a little bit before they leaf out. Sometimes they leaf out at the same time, but generally flowering a little bit before they start to leaf out. So that's what you can look for here over the coming months. But let's end by going into why it's so important to keep leaf litter around in your yard as much as you can, and what's happening in that leaf litter at a time of year like this, when we've got cold weather and a snowstorm on its way, an ice storm maybe on its way, why that leaf litter is so important for lots of different wildlife. So for wildlife right now, they can't just head inside and turn on the fireplace and warm up. They've got to live out there in this snow and ice that's coming our way. So for them, they can't go put on a coat as some invertebrate or other organism in that leaf litter. They've got to tolerate and handle whatever is thrown at them by the natural world if they're going to survive. So this leaf litter gives them a place where it is relatively warm against that soil under a thick mat of leaves compared to what's out there in the open air. And that soil there under the leaf litter is moist, so they don't dry out so easily. So it's a good way to hunker down and survive the winter before things warm up in the spring. So there's lots of life to find in that leaf litter if you look closely, or simply turn over some leaves and look up at what's in that leaf litter. So for instance, there is a cocoon of one of our native moths right here. And this is one that I found off on a hike a couple of years ago where there was this fallen oak leaf. And right there, dangling off of that stalk, is the cocoon of a polyphemus moth with its pupa inside. Now, this one had already emerged out and hopefully gone off to become a polyphemus moth, which is rather large. Looks like this one right here with those big eyes or eye-like structures on the hind wing. But they're not an uncommon cocoon to find either dangling up on an oak leaf in the wintertime or maybe fallen down into the leaf litter like this one right here. In that leaf litter, they're able to not dry out as much. They can stay warmer, and so that helps them to survive these cold spells of the winter. Now, if you can't keep around leaf litter everywhere, at least hopefully you can try to do it as much as you can within your covenants and all of the things that we have to deal with for many people nowadays. But to contrast the importance of leaf litter with what you might find in many areas, like say in a park where it's more like this, the problem with this area here in this picture is there's not a lot of leaf litter. So any sort of caterpillar that was feeding on the leaves up on this tree during the summertime pupated, went down to the ground or fell to the ground. There's not a lot of cover for it there. There's not leaf litter. There's not rocks or logs to go under, any of that natural substrate that they're adapted to off in the woodlands of the historical past. It's not there. So that's a challenge for them. The wood mulch that is there is probably pretty hard, not easy to burrow down into, and not nearly as insulative of the cold air as leaf litter would be. Compound that with the fact that these areas are oftentimes mown quite a bit, and that heavy lawnmower going by every week to mow the grass with those tires starts to compact that soil. And as that soil gets hard from compaction, that makes it harder for that caterpillar to burrow down into that soil and pupate to overwinter. So soil compaction relative to what they would have off in the woods can be a big deal for many of these native moths and butterflies looking to go down into that leaf litter and survive the winter. So problems here in a situation like this, there's not leaf litter to protect you. The bark mulch doesn't give you much protection. And that soil compaction where you can't get down into the warm soil. So that's where we can hopefully encourage more wild spaces or piles of leaves to build a planting bed or a mulch bed around some of our trees and bushes to give that natural habitat for caterpillars to overwinter in many forms of life to overwinter. So some of the species that you would find out there right now, like the Ilia underwing moth, which has this bright orangish red on its underwing or hindwing that it can flash at you to scare you away as a potential predator, they need that leaf litter to survive. And they do that overwintering in the egg stage. So it's not a caterpillar down there or a pupal case, it's an egg on those leaves down there in the leaf litter. And oftentimes for this species, they are on oaks. That's what they feed on. So as those oak leaves fall down, that's where the eggs are attached, and they'll survive, hopefully, in that nice cover of leaf litter over the winter. Other species overwinter in the caterpillar stage. So species like the giant leopard moth, which I profiled today on my Southern Piedmont Natural History Facebook and Instagram, looks like this right here with this black caterpillar with all these spikes or setae and these red rings going along the body. That's what they look like when they're overwintering under a log in the leaf litter in that warm, moist habitat, surviving the winter. And they've also got some tricks up their sleeve where they can survive based on molecules within their body. these molecules like glycerol that allow them to reduce the formation of ice that could damage and kill the cells of their bodies. So they can actually survive a few degrees below freezing for a long time period and still survive as this curled up caterpillar that has much of the water in its body as ice. They can tolerate that with these chemicals like glycerol within their body. And there's several moths and caterpillars that have that glycerol material or other materials that help them survive the cold and ice formation. In terms of species that it feeds on, there's several different native trees, things like black cherries, many of our native oaks, native willow trees like a black willow. That's the type of food that these caterpillars of giant leopard moths feed on. And if you want to see the moth, they are a beautiful moth to see. They're black and white with all this turquoise and orange. I've got a picture of one on my social media today. It's a beautiful moth to find if you've ever seen a giant leopard moth with the leopard spotting on the moth. Another one, this one overwinters as a pupa, which is the way that many of our moths and butterflies overwinter. And that's what the Virginian tiger moth here does, where it feeds on many different native trees as a caterpillar and then crawls down to the ground, forms this hard pupal case where it's going to overwinter in leaf litter or under a log, under a rock, and then come out as a moth like this one right here next year. But to get to next year, it's got to survive the winter. And that means you need the protection of leaf litter and other structures because that's what it's adapted to. It's not going to do it on open turf grass or a parking lot, something like that. That protective leaf litter is what it needs. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you may have or answer anything that might be on your mind regarding this talk or other things. So feel free to ask away.
All right, thanks again, Dr. Storm. That was very informative and fascinating. So I had one question. There's a few that were written in the Q&A, so I'll give everybody a chance to put something in there if you would like. But just to start it off, I wanted to ask, so for the evergreen invasive plants, so like southern magnolia and cherry laurel who come up from the coastal plain, but then all the other stuff that comes over from Asia that are evergreen in the winter, what damage does that give or produce in our ecosystem?
Yeah, so one of the challenges with them is if they are evergreen, or maybe they are a plant like Chinese privet that really leaves out early in the spring and forms a dense shade, is they will shade out our native spring wildflowers that come out in very late winter, early spring, when the sunlight's coming down onto the forest floor, typically. But now with these evergreens, they're shaded out and they can't grow up and do their photosynthesis to get those energy stores that they need to produce seeds and to grow up next year. So for many of those early spring wildflowers, what they're adapted to do is to come out early in the year before all of the overstory has leafed out. They're leafed out, they've got their flowers out, and that's when they do all of their work, and then they get shaded out. But Carolina cherry laurel as a nuisance plant coming up from the coastal plain more through plantings and such, that can get pretty dense and shade out what would have been some patches of spring beauty or bloodroot, whatever it might be. Does that answer your question?
Yep. There's really as an education, I want everybody to be aware of that. So
Sure.
Leslie Fiddler asked two questions. One, I'm going to ask the second one first. It was very interesting. Is there not, I mean, if there's not enough cold, what happens to stratification?
It's probably not going to germinate at all or not at a high rate. So that's why if you are, say, stratifying seeds in a refrigerator or in some sort of outdoor planting bed, whatever you might be doing, if you only stratify it for like a week or 2 weeks, it's not going to germinate. it needs to have 60 days or 90 days, and also typically stay moist, not wet where it's going to get fungal growth or rot, but just a little moist like soil would have or under leaf litter. That's going to help it germinate. Uh, so many seeds simply won't germinate just as a rule. But if you don't have it stratified long enough or with enough moisture for consistent time periods, you're probably not going to get hardly any germination at all, if any at all. So they need that cue of spring's over or winter's over, time to germinate at spring. They're dependent on that cue. It's been a very reliable cue to them for a long time period.
Okay, so another question she had was, can all pine needles be used for tea and anti?
That I am not sure on for all pine needles. What I would do is look in a reputable foraging book for that. Uh, and there are several out there that you could look at. You just have to be careful. There's apparently a lot of foraging books that are written by AI now that may not be the most reliable. But I would check a book like that just to be sure. But that'd be what I would do.
Yeah. So for like the cambium layer where you do have moisture and it's more soft and so general stems and wood, do they freeze? And is that a problem?
Uh, Generally not. So if it were to freeze, what can happen on some trees is as that water starts to get cold and freeze, it'll burst open the bark as one symptom you can see of the tree actually freezing on the inside. But trees have adaptations, kind of like that glycerol that we talked about with the giant leopard moth, where they will have a sugar concentrated sap of their water in the xylem and their phloem, where that sugar concentration helps to lower the freezing point, similar to what we use salts for to raise that freezing point. They'll help to lower that freezing point where they don't freeze at, say, 31 or 30. They'll get to a little bit colder before they start to freeze and damage the tissues of that plant, of that tree, for instance.
Yep.
So, and that outer protective bark with its air pockets and thick layering gives a lot of protection of that underlying living tissue as well. And so it helps to insulate it from the cold temperatures.
Yeah. So Seth just asked a question, which I was wondering myself. So for some of these host plants that may be in landscaping, will the insects travel any distance to find leaf litter, or does the leaf litter need to be directly below the trees and host plants to maximize the benefit to the insects?
It would depend on the insect, but for your typical caterpillar, say it's an oak worm coming down off a southern red oak and looking to pupate, it can travel, several meters, but it's pretty adapted to find suitable soil nearby. It's not going to crawl for like a mile or something like that. So you want leaf litter right around the base of that tree and in the surrounding uh, meters to feed as much as you can to give it a place to get to leaf litter quickly. If you've got the nearest leaf litter, 20 meters away, it might not find it unless it takes just the right vector to hit that. It could travel 20 meters looking for habitat, but it would have to take the right orientation to find it. So the more you can have under bushes around your landscaping, around trees, the easier it is to find, the more success you're going to have with those caterpillars finding a place to go, because they're not going to go long distances and just hunt down leaf litter.
So under trees is important.
Yes.
But I will point out, you can rake the leaves or blow the leaves off your lawn and just keep them on the edges. Just try to have them underneath the tree, so you don't have to have a totally, what most people would consider, ugly lawn without any manicured. You can still get some benefits with adaptations and keeping the leaves in certain places. So I think that is it. I don't see any more questions. So Again, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Storm. Thanks, Lily Vincennes, who's the chairman of the Education Committee. She's helps run the Zoom for us. And we look forward to seeing you all in the spring for the last of our seasonal explorations. And I just want to remind you that we are actually in the Piedmont, even though it feels like we're in the Arctic right now. So thanks again. If you haven't renewed your membership or haven't joined the GNPS, please go to that gnps.org and do that. Thanks again, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.